Chapter 14. The Trial. The elves appeared again, and Sauron went forward when they motioned. Right inside was a short flight of stairs, which they went up. Sauron was a bit more than reluctant to go up them. However, he made it to the top without losing it. Standing there, he instantly stiffened, unconsciously, of course. There was a crescent of seats facing towards him, and without counting, he knew there was 14. And there were more, others who were not seated. Sauron looked around the group, slowly recognizing the faces of the people present. There was Vana and Orome, and Tolkas and Nessa. Tolkas looked about ready to pummel him, and Sauron was almost a bit glad that they were at a council so that he would not get the chance, for a while at least. Next to them was Naina, who had just about instantly burst into tears as soon as Sauron had entered and was continuing to carry on. He looked at her and shook his head. She had always tried to be such a drama queen, and apparently hadn't gotten out of the phase yet. There was Urmo, who was very similar in appearance to his brother Nemo, only a bit less brooding-looking. Today he seemed to have it remarkably together and was concentrating on what was going on at the moment instead of staring off into space daydreaming. His wife, Este, sat next to him, sleeping, which didn't surprise Sauron much as that was pretty much all she did anyways. Of course, near them was Vare and Nemo, which Sauron wondered a bit to see, considering that earlier it seemed he wouldn't be coming. Then again, he figured that it wouldn't have been much of a party without the Doomsman. Sauron was able to tell that him being there was a really big deal when he saw Ulmo, considering that he had always done just about anything he could to get out of the councils. Ulmo must have felt that this was important enough that he should be present. While Sauron felt a bit proud of the fact that he had warranted Ulmo getting out of the sea for once, it also made him about 20 times more apprehensive. Then there was Yavanna, and next to her sat Aule. His face was blank and unreadable, but it didn't take any amount of intelligence to figure out that he was quietly seething. Sauron felt about 1,000,000 memories that had gotten lost in a heap of them he had accumulated over time try to resurface themselves. However, he put a mental cork over them, as that was not the time. Not that he was really planning on ever letting himself have the time. Still, he couldn't push off the fact that he had learned much from Aule, and that he owed a lot of his own works to his teachings, however reluctant he was to admit it, even to himself. And last was Manwë and Varda, and it was the sight of them that caused Sauron to feel as though his knees would give out. That was definitely not acceptable behavior, however, as laying down on the floor would do nothing for that plan of acting with conceited dignity. It might have been okay if he had been thinking of going down the path of pretending to sue for pardon, but he had figured out long before, meaning about 2 days ago while he had laid staring at the ceiling of his cell, that they wouldn't be making the same mistake with him as they had with Morgoth. So considering that he did not have a plan B, he had to do everything in his power to keep hold on the original one. It was harder than he thought it would be. But then that part of him in which the disposition of a Dark Lord had been ingrained, which is about 99%, kicked in. He almost felt disgusted, amazingly. However, the presence of that emotion did not make the feeling that he was going to make the ground's acquaintance go away. It just gave him enough gumption to be ready to try and make some snippy remarks. The 2 elves slowly walked back towards the gate, but Sauron hardly noticed them go. He was watching the Valar, waiting for which one would speak first. As he waited, one of the people who stood behind Manwë and Varda stepped forward, and Sauron recognized him as Eonwë.
Great,
Sauron thought to himself.
I'm going to get listed.
At least that is what he thought would happen. It seemed likely that they would want to rant off all the things which he had done that had gone against the designs or whatever in hopes of making him see how bad he had really been. Not that he needed them to recount all the events for him to see that he had been bad, as he knew he was being so whenever he had done them, which was often. In fact, half of the fun of doing all those terrible things was knowing that they were terrible.
It has been the decision of those present that you realize what you have done, and therefore will not need to have them retold to you,
Eonwë said in answer to his thoughts. Ah, yes. He'd forgotten that just like he had been able to read Haldir's thoughts, they would be able to read his. That would make things a bit more interesting.
So, if you're not trying just to put me in my place, wherever you happen to think that is, then what are you trying to do?
Oh, but they are going to put you in your place,
Yonwei said, a slight smirk on his face. Then he whispered,
You should have just come along when I told you to, and you would have been able to skip most of this.
Sauron replied in an equally quiet voice.
Yes, but I would have also missed the height of my power. My golden age, as you all might say.
Well, I hope it was worth it.
He turned to the assembly and raised his voice so that they could hear.
Here is Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, enemy of the people of Arda,
he said as way of formal introduction. Sauron did not really agree with such a declaration. He had, after all, been serving himself for the last 2 ages, even if he had been following a lot of the principles that Morgoth had set down. And he wasn't the enemy of everybody, just most of everybody. Yonwei then returned to his spot, and Manwë spoke, his voice possessing such power that although Sauron wanted to say something smart-mouthed, he could not.
Let Nemo pronounce his doom.
Well, that was right to the point. All things considered, he would probably be done in less than 5 minutes. Nemo stood up, and it was interesting to note how much more solemn his mood was, now that it had been like a day ago. Of course, it would have lessened the tension in the air, and such trials were probably supposed to be very rigid. Sauron thought that Nemo had a pretty cool job description, with the whole Lord of the Halls of the Dead and Doomsman of the Valar thing. Only he didn't think that he would actually want to have that job, unless it was just the doom part. Doom always seemed synonymous with bad things happening to people, and that was always fun, unless you were on the receiving side, like he was now. He was shaken from his thoughts upon hearing Nemo's voice.
From now on, you shall abide in Valinor, and that condition will never be lifted for any reason.
Even though it was disheartening to hear, it was not anything that he had not expected.
For an age you will not be allowed to go anywhere without Haldir of Lothlorien. After that time you will have leave to come and go in the limits of Valinor as you please. Yet if you have need to go any further than that, Haldir must go along too.
Poor Haldir. That'd be more of a punishment for him than anybody else.
You will not touch any sort of weapon for any reason.
Sauron couldn't care less about weapons. He had only wielded one on a few occasions, namely when the situation looked very bad, so he hadn't really gotten any sort of love for them. The art of making them, perhaps, but not really the things themselves. Then that whole thing with his finger getting hacked off really hadn't increased any appeal they had to him.
Occasionally, you will be required to help in different tasks as we see fit.
Sauron congratulated himself on having successfully guessed that one.
Under no condition will you reveal your identity to anybody.
Whatever.
I'm serious, for no reason. If you do, not only will it backlash against you, but will make sure that you don't think that it was truly worth saying.
Sauron wondered what more they could possibly take away. It wasn't a good thing to wonder, as it was a law of nature that whenever such a question was speculated, something would come along and make the situation worse.
And any power you have which makes you above the firstborn will be blocked against you until you have proven that you can be responsible with those that you were originally endowed with.
That took a couple moments to process. His ears had really piped up when he had heard power, as that was a word that had always been quite important to him. However, the rest of the sentence didn't make complete sense at first. And he finally got it. He felt as though he'd swallowed a chunk of lead or something.
You're not serious,
he said, as more of a shocked statement than a question.
Actually, we are.
But,
he said, yet he couldn't get any more words out than that.
But what? You don't think that we have the authority to do that?
Sauron didn't answer, or more correctly, couldn't answer. So much for conceded dignity. The plan had been pretty much crushed by that lead weight.
See, this is the part that is putting you in your place.
For a moment more, he stood there silently reeling, trying to figure out what all this would mean. However, then that flicker of anger within him kindled. He was a bit surprised that it had been so dim all that time.
My place is not as an elf!
He spat, his ears ringing so that he could not even hear himself speak. He felt a strange desire to stamp his foot, but he suppressed it.
Neither was trying to be the Lord of Arda, and yet you seem to think that you could grace such a position. Now you just need to learn to look to a new station.
Sauron felt his brows pulled down into a tighter knot than they had been before.
You do not think that enough of my power had been destroyed in my ruin?
He asked, although he had trouble getting the words to form on his tongue.
I think that the actions that we are taking would mean that we do not believe that enough of it has been destroyed.
He considered replying, but something perked up inside him and doused his rage. There wasn't any way that he could fight the present situation and win. He knew that he could not change their minds, and that arguing would probably make it worse than better. So, although he did not want to accept the fact that this is the way his life was going to be, he did, to a point. In doing so, a question popped into his mind that somewhat revolted him. Not really the question, but that he had thought of it so promptly. It made him think that he was perhaps accepting this a bit too quickly.
Now,
he began slowly, absently tugging on his belt.
When you say that I'll only have those abilities or whatever, that are those that the firstborn have, are you referring to the Eldar or the Morroquindi?
Although he couldn't be quite sure, Sauron almost thought that Nemo might have smirked. However, the expression was so fleeting that it just might have been a shift in the squinty light.
Well, it wouldn't really do for you to have such an advantage over Haldir. Therefore it'll probably be the same as he. Morroquindi.
Sauron cursed under his breath, but didn't say anything audible.